just as by way of explanation, Chris and I have divided up the work, yes. I'm going to do this presentation, but Chris will join me, if that's okay, for questions, because this is based on work that we've recently done together, a book called Indigenous Criminology. But we swap next week. Chris goes to ANZSOC, I'm too poor to go, and he'll be doing a joint presentation for us. So I just wanted to make that clear that I haven't usurped, his authority or what have you, okay? It's a really good division of labour, isn't it, Chris? Yeah. Okay, now, what I'm going to do is something quite different, I think, from our first two speakers. It's not going to be so personal, but it is going to be a critique of a particular discipline, the discipline that I am apparently part of, that is criminology. And I will personalise this by saying that what I'm about to say is reflective of, and I'm only speaking for myself, not for Chris, my increasing uncomfortability with being labelled or calling myself a criminologist. Yeah? So in other words, I'm going to bag my own discipline. Yes, okay. Okay, by the way, Chris hasn't seen this yet. So I'm going to see, because I was up till 3 o'clock this morning rewriting it, so I'm going to use the we a lot, but he may wish to say I don't really own that part, okay? So just saying it's the we, it's really me, and then if he wants to disown anything, by all means do. So I think it's safe to say in this room that without doubt criminology is a discipline, an academic discipline, that is deserving of significant critical attention by Indigenous scholars and our non-Indigenous colleagues and collaborators such as Chris Kineen, Harry Bragg-Thalia and others, right? The reason is it's because so much of what its adherents do or continues, or the work that they do within criminology continues to legitimise social, political and legal practices that we believe fuels, or partly fuels, or significantly fuels, if you like, the extraordinary levels of criminalisation and incarceration of Indigenous peoples in all settler colonial jurisdictions. Yeah, so that's my opening statement. We're going to focus on two things. Okay, the first is the way in which I'm going to critique criminology, the way in which the discipline has, in the words of our colleague Biko, become a control freak, okay, intent on attaining and protecting its hegemony, its rule over the production of something that's called legitimate knowledge about crime control and social harm, okay, and especially we argue, sorry Chris, okay, and what is considered legitimate knowledge about what we call the Indigenous problem. Indigenous overrepresentation and incarceration. Secondly, I then want to try and finish a bit more positively by demonstrating the added value and comparison of Indigenous perspectives, or in actual fact empowering the Indigenous perspective and approach, and perhaps even, if you like, the development of an Indigenous criminology. Okay. So I want to start off by focusing on what we think, I'm not going to get used to this, is a significant and epistemological, philosophical, or theoretical blind spot of mainstream criminology. I am, by other criminologists in the room, I am generalising. Those of you know if you're not one of these criminologists, okay, so don't take it personally, okay, and you probably know who I'm talking about. I don't need to name names. Okay, but this blind spot is almost a total lack of any theorisation of colonialism and the colonial context in terms of the impact that it has had on Indigenous peoples, okay? What our colleagues like Harry Blagg, Biko and others, I think in recent years have drawn our attention to is the historical connections between the development of the discipline of criminology in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, and the interrelated projects of colonialism and Western imperialism. By taking the American and European criminological traditions as its point of departure, much of Australasian criminology, we argue actually, this explains for us in part why so much of Australasian criminology operates without a theory of colonialism, and why it appears to be willfully blind to the impact of this particular event. The lack of awareness of or willingness to confront its colonial past, in other words, we're arguing that criminology is part of that colonial context and machine of dispossession, okay, then makes, we believe, many of its adherents blind to the intersectional drivers, the complex drivers of contemporary Indigenous overrepresentation. Now that's the past, right? Yeah, so that's impacting current practice. Especially concerning for those of us who work in this field of Indigenous justice or Indigenous criminology, is that so much of this mainstream or Western criminology appears to be largely immune to, if you like, the pleadings of Biko and Chris and I and others, that it extricate itself from yet another blind spot or related blind spot, okay, that many of its adherents suffer from. And namely, that they can't see their own role as a colonial project in the contemporary moment. Not just the part, they're not only blind to the colonial history and the dispossessing history that underlines the development of the discipline, they are also blind, whether willfully or unknowingly, of the role it plays as a colonial project in our continued subjugation of Indigenous peoples. So how does the discipline provide support for the continued colonial or neo-colonial disposition and subjugation of Indigenous peoples, right? And there is a number of strategies and practices that Chris and I talk about in our book across a number of chapters, but I only have time to talk about a couple, right? And they're two of my favourites, okay? The first is that many of its practitioners work tirelessly to silence the Indigenous experience and the Indigenous voice. Okay, there's a whole industry within Australasian criminology that works to silence our perspectives and to privilege theirs, and especially those from outside the Australasian context, and most definitely outside the Indigenous context. Okay. So they work tirelessly to silence us. And our critique, both of the discipline itself, something that I've been experiencing quite a bit lately, and of our critique, especially of its partner that it relies on for its very existence, which is the criminal justice system. Right? A key strategy within criminology is the dismissal of Indigenous knowledge about the social world. And this is evidenced by those oft-used terms that we hear at conferences like NSOC, I'll name NSOC, ASC and others, when scholars, Indigenous scholars like myself and our non-Indigenous critical collaborators speak about the research, how we do our own research, how we inform our perspectives. In other words, our knowledge, words like subjective, unscientific. My favourite, when I was in America a couple of years ago, folk epistemology, okay, all used to cast doubt on the validity of our endeavours and of the rightness, if you like, of our own intellectual and knowledge construction processes. Castro Gomez describes this strategy as an exercise in creating the other of reason. The other of reason. Basically what it means is they're saying you don't have reason, okay? Which in turn supports attempts to exclude other ways of knowing from the Western criminological lexicon, and hopefully, and this is the political context, to put up significant barriers to our ability to inform the policy process. Okay, so this is the relationship to power, okay, the power to control knowledge. Our critical analysis of criminology, I think in the book, reveals two overwhelming related issues. First, that academic criminology is complicit in the silencing of Indigenous experiences and perspectives in the construction and pursuit of knowledge about crime and social harm. And second, that many Indigenous peoples actually experience criminology as a part of the epistemic violence of neo-colonial context, of the settler colonial crime control complex. In other words, the discipline is actually part of the problem, even I would argue, and hopefully Chris would agree with me, when it presents it, that's what I wrote here, when it presents itself as providing the only empirically based solutions, right? This silencing, by the way, is nothing new. You know, Indigenous systems of knowledge, this is just a continuation of old colonial projects. The Indigenous systems of knowledge about economy, law, governance were attacked and devalued by colonial institutions, okay, on the basis that our social systems, our knowledge systems and institutions were inferior. For example, Rigney argues that, and quote, if one's racial superiority could be scientifically legitimated, then the logical conclusion could be drawn that the scientific methods used in other cultures to investigate or transmit knowledge were inferior and irrational. Race theories laid the firm foundation for determining whose knowledge was valid, whose science was legitimate. And we argue that that philosophy that drug explains, I think, some of the quite bigoted responses to the work that has been, critical work that has been done in the last decade or two by Indigenous scholars and our non-Indigenous critical collaborators. For Indigenous scholars and Indigenous communities, the specific danger of criminology's drive for policy relevance, again, that's the political context, okay, the relationship to power, is its denial of Indigenous epistemologies and knowledge as valid techniques for developing effective responses to social harm that occurs in or against Indigenous communities. Furthermore, understanding criminology as a science of oppression, as Lynch describes it, enables us to uncover the interconnections between the practice of social science or criminology, the construction of social control policies and interventions, and the criminalisation of Indigenous peoples in the contemporary settler colonial context. Right. As individuals and as an academic collective, criminologists often contribute to the colonial project of our exclusion and our disempowerment through the very act of doing criminology. An example, for example, when they undertake contractual research, again, please don't take this personally, you know, you don't kind of do these things I'm doing. You undertake contractual research for government, which by their very nature limits or denies us input into the design and the administration of the research on us. In the Indigenous context, all too often criminologists conduct research on Indigenous issues while, I might muck this word up, I knew I shouldn't have rewritten this at 3 o'clock in the morning, proselytizing from afar, all right? Utilising predominantly as our colleague Antje Deckert has said, non-engaging, or as spoken about recently in a few papers, non-engaging methods, okay? Because, of course, we must adhere to this mythical thing called objectivity, right? Because only then can we say anything of validity by the very fact that we have no relationship with it. I find that a frankly bizarre and contradictory notion. Okay. I'm just going to skip ahead because how much time have I got, Ansha?
Till 15 to quarter past.
Okay. Okay, in a thought-provoking piece on the support her discipline gave to colonial context, Wendy James referred to anthropologists as, and I quote, reluctant imperialists. Reluctant imperialists. Which to me, reading between the lines, I thought that she meant, meaning that their support for the colonial enterprise was largely unplanned or unintentional. That reminded me of the recent New Zealand Police Commissioner who said there is no racism in the New Zealand Police, just unintended, was it unintended bias? Unconscious bias. So that time I was out on the drink with my mates in Wellington in 1994 when the cop grabbed me. I don't know why he grabbed me, but he grabbed me and referred to me as a smart-ass hoary. He clearly was unleashing his unconscious racism on me. Anyway. So arguably what she was arguing was, with anthropology, seeking to do good by Indigenous people, anthropologists have inadvertently provided support to the colonial enterprise of dispossession, right? Well, we are a little bit reluctant to offer some criminologists the same benefit of the doubt. For example, what are we to make of the continued control freak tendencies of Australasian criminology, especially its more authoritarian, that's two bears, especially its more authoritarian adaptations? It is far too easy to dismiss the recurrent focus on the individual native, someone divorced from their social, historical and structural context, as is often the case in the work of adherents who dismiss the validity of Indigenous forms of knowledge, as Don Weatherburn did a year or two ago in a book he wrote on Aboriginal imprisonment, when he stated that all we ever need to know about crime we can learn from Western science. He was basically saying that there's nothing they can learn from us. Yeah? And just to spread the love, okay, the New Zealand version of that was Danette Marie in an article published in a special edition, edited by Don, in 2010 in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Crim, okay, about with a critique of Māori crime, when she basically said the same thing. In actual fact, the two of them and Rod Broadhurst, and I'm skipping my notes here, in actual fact, I wouldn't say colluded. Yeah, no, they haven't colluded, but have mysteriously come to the same conclusion over the last decade or so. Don Weatherburn and Rod Broadhurst have, in slightly different ways, made the same argument here about Australian context as Danette has made about New Zealand. And that is that the reason why the criminal justice system and criminology has not been so successful in reducing Indigenous overrepresentation and incarceration is because there's been too much focus on institutions, too much focus on institutional racism and bias, yeah? Too much focus on policing and not enough focus, okay, on the individual proclivities, on the individual offender, okay, on those components of our, or parts of our culture and our social context that explains crime. Okay, far too much focus on the structure and not individuals. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes. Yeah. In fact, here we go. This is what Broadhurst writes. It has become necessary to shift the criminological imagination away from the previous focus on judicial bias or racism as the cause of excessive Indigenous imprisonment. The recommended solutions should surprise no one, and all three of them make similar solutions. Return the criminological gaze firmly back to the much neglected Aboriginal pathological individual, dysfunctional family unit, and for the likes of that well-regarded Australian criminologist Andrew Bolt, the criminalising culture of Australians' Aboriginal peoples. All right? No one would suppose from their descriptions of the problem why we can't solve the Aboriginal issue or the Indigenous issue. You would suppose from their description of the problem that suddenly prisons were empty, We weren't using prisons. Police no longer patrolled Indigenous communities incessantly and aggressively. You could easily form the impression that Aboriginal Māori offenders were being diverted en masse into adjudication processes dominated by us, by Indigenous peoples, that they received predominantly non-custodial forms of punishment when sentenced. And if they receive such a sentence, they end up spending their sentence in an Indigenous cultural unit or halfway house run by their own people. And of course, upon release, return to communities that have benefited from extensive infrastructural, social and economic investment by the government. No. Yeah, right? Yeah. That's not the situation at all. Yes, unquestionably, the actions of Broadhurst, what he calls the legal welfare establishment, the bleeding hearts, has led to the establishment or introduction of a range of diversionary programs and policies, introduction of restorative justice-centred processes. In Australia, Aboriginal liaison officers, in New Zealand, iwi liaison officers, etc. And in New Zealand, say some things like, say, prison-based cultural units like the Māori focus units, yeah? So we've kind of got some little wins. But despite all this activity, the impression given by the three authors I've cited, and others who say similar things to them, that the failure of liberal policy discourse and the critical focus on structure and racism in institutions is a gross exaggeration. At no time during the period in which Indigenous overrepresentation has been a significant issue in both our jurisdictions has the so-called liberal or Indigenous perspective dominated crime control in either jurisdiction. Furthermore, if we accept the alternative argument that in fact the vast majority of crime control policies and interventions, in fact there's been, sorry, I apologise, I'll go back. If we accept the alternative argument, then in fact the vast majority of crime control spend in Australia and New Zealand has in fact been on imported crime control policies and interventions, from North America, Western Europe, Great Britain, and not on Indigenous inspired ones, which is the case. I want to see the evidence that the Western scientific dominated criminological response to the Indigenous problem has in fact significantly reduced our overrepresentation. I find it interesting that where we start talking about discrete little projects that we have, like the one in Kimberley and that there's a question. It's like, what evidence do you have that it works? Which is a fair empirical question, yeah, and a criminological question. And it's like, well, you're asking us to do what you as criminologists, mainstream criminologists who support criminal justice system and the criminal justice system itself, can almost never do. Because I always go, well, where's your evidence that your courts are reducing offending? Where's your evidence that your prisons? Oh, no. And it's funny, and you know what the answer is? Sorry, my apologies to any policy people here. Well, one, actually trying to identify the impact of a significant concrete policy or thing, there's so many, yes, it's hard, isn't it? Because there are so many things that intersect and impact. But our ones, we get asked, we're a little discrete little project that gets 300 grand a year compared to the 400 or 500 million for the New South Wales prisons, but we have to justify that, yeah? That's what I'm bringing us back to, that silencing process I'm talking about. If you can't give us your evidence, shut up. Where's yours? Oh, it's highly complicated. Highly complicated. Highly complicated. Okay, that's enough of the moan. All right? There's some other things that they actually, I find interesting about criminology that I think needs to be contested. And there's two things, and there's couple of things. One is that that this idea about that our methodologies, our epistemologies, we get too close to our communities. We're not objective enough, right? We're not objective enough, and I think that in actual fact that's a strength of our work most clearly. Yeah. And an example I had here, which I'll just say briefly, was a good friend of mine, a colleague, Winona Victor, who's from the Starlo First Nation in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. In the 90s, when she was a master's student, the elders went to her and said, we're a bit sick of this westernised criminal justice process that criminalises our kids. We want to resurrect our own system, Kwikostom, right? Kwikostom. And she spent the next 3 or 4 years. She had to spend a year for the elders teaching her. They had to. She won't mind me saying this, by the way, even if it's recorded. So I'm being careful because she scares me the hell out of me. They know she's known back at home as the queen of conflict. She does not take a backward step in taking on the system, so to speak. And she certainly wouldn't hesitate to tell me what she thinks of what I'm saying, right? But basically, they started retrained her, because she'd been taught as a criminologist, and they retrained her. No, this is how you actually do research with us. She went through this whole process in developing the system, all right? On the way, by the way, they went to the Mounties, the Royal Mounties, they went to corrections, they went to childcare protection and said, we're going to do this, our own stuff, right? We're going to resurrect our own system, a longhouse justice system, Kwikos. And they said, okay, that's cool, yep. And we're going to get our own referrals from our own people, but we also would like to take care of our own youth coming through your systems. Yep, no problem. And twice in 2 years, they tried to load onto them 2 foreign systems or processes. The imported, so-called Māori-inspired or based family group conferencing, and sentencing circle, which was developed by a couple of white judges near Saskatchewan somewhere, I think. No disrespect to nice people, but basically were known in them rejected, right? They were forced to take FGC, but they basically just moulded it and changed it, right? But what I want to this is a quote that she talks about. Our experience at the Longhouse taught me a valuable lesson, that we have all we need right here. I mean no respect, but we don't need the Māori. The reason for that is that how the FGC got sold to them was the Royal Mounties rang up and said, it's a Maori project and we're going to send someone along to train you in how to use this Maori project. And this white woman turned up. And I've got not a quote here, but a quote in her thesis where an elder turns around and goes, these Maoris must be crazy because this is not an Indigenous process. And then her and I had a few chats and shared some work and she went, oh, thank God for that. So that explains that, right? We don't need a fancy hotel to work in to legitimise what we are learning. That's where they held the training for these governmental processes. And no disrespect, we don't need a judge to teach us about circles and their sacredness. We have our own culture, our own teachers, our own elders, our own language, and our own learning environment. The message is clear. If we are going to revitalise our culture, don't do it in the Hoalatum or European world. Right? So basically, what Winona actually was able to do in the end, over 4 or 5 years, was to help reconstruct, their own system again and resurrect it. And we would argue that basically, then she talks about, right near the end, she was struggling about how she pulled this all together, and she talks about she had an epiphany. One day, that all-important paradigm shift occurred in my mind, a lesson in decolonising one's mind, an epiphany, if you will. Justice to the stylo within a stylo worldview does not look anything like justice one finds within the Canadian criminal justice system. The criminal justice system may focus on crime, prosecution, prison, and punishment, but stylo justice is centred on family. It includes the role of elders, the role of the family ties and connections, teachings, spirituality. As we describe below, each of these elements is now present and guides our Kwikostom process. One can see the added value of an Indigenous scholar like Winona, not only being an insider, a member of the stylo community, but also as an institutionally linked and trained researcher tasked with gathering knowledge. The question we believe that critical criminologists, or all criminologists actually need to ask is, especially some of them should ask this themselves, would it have been possible for a complete and objective and detached outsider to have gained the trust of the elders that Winona did? Perhaps, but that would be very rare. Certainly it has happened before on a number of occasions in other criminological research undertaken. However, we argue that the opportunity for the epiphany that occurred, and that was significant in how she then went back to the elders and said, here's the model, and they said, yes, that is it. Took place, is limited for those not embedded in the Indigenous, and particularly the stylo social context, who have not the trust and guidance of the elders or the interconnections, and who do not have a direct stake in the policy and justice initiative being formed. Is that it? Can I just wait one last statement? Okay, yeah, I'll finish with this. Right. I just talked recently about when Chris and I published a book. You can buy it from from Policy Press. Yeah. Wait till next year when the soft cover comes out. Okay. In the book, we discuss what we believe are some useful principles upon which to construct an Indigenous variant of the discipline. Right. And I don't have time for a full discussion here. Okay, but however, what we think will constitute this thing called Indigenous criminology. However, we can say with certainty that it will not or should not be primarily concerned with being of utility to the policy industry. Okay, the fact is that so much of what passes for Australasian criminology is tethered firmly to the government teat, okay, whether because it's in direct contractual relationship and receives money from it, or the very fact that when it does do research for them, it fails to ask critical questions of the institutions of social control. Okay? It belies the oft-made claim by its adherents to be objective in either a political or epistemological sense. It is no such thing, the discipline. It is very much a political animal, one that preys on the bodies, physically, theoretically, and epistemologically speaking, of Indigenous peoples. It gorges on the wairua, the very essence of Indigenous peoples and their culture in the name of science, often in the name of self-aggrandizement and financial procurement on the behalf of the academic institutions in which they belong. In comparison, an Indigenous or a counter-colonial criminology, you call it what you like, or an anti-authoritarian criminology, will be by its very nature political. It's absolutely essential that it is political. It will be undertaken with Indigenes or Indigenous peoples on their terms, and it will seek to give voice and privilege their experiences. Okay. Therefore, following our colleague Biko's sage advice, an Indigenous criminology would turn away from the historical and uncritical replication of Western criminological knowledge, rejecting theories and research methods and crime control policies and interventions that, quote, maximise the exploitation and repression of the masses. The emphasis of our criminological endeavour shall be academic activism, with an unflinching focus on state crime in historical and contemporary context, on seeking reparations for genocide, whether physical or cultural, on the rapacious behaviour of globalising crime control corporations like RJ, who seek to profit from our knowledge, instead of following the imperialist obsession with crimes of the poor. Thank you very much.
I'm just asking Chris to come down for questions as well. Questions, comments for the presenter?
I'm just tweeting, and Damien Bonson is following our tweets. He's the founder of Black Rainbow.
Aye.
Yeah, you know about Black
Yes,
Rainbow.
yep.
So, yeah, he's one of Australia's probably most prominent Indigenous suicide researchers. So he's in Broome, and he's asking what methodology and process are you using in your work?
In this book, or just in general, the research. Personally,
I think he's keen to know where you're sitting, I guess.
Where I'm sitting, well, I'm certainly not an empiricist. Non-empiricist. Yeah. I mean, methodologically, where I sit is that I actually go and work with with the communities themselves. Does that make sense? I mean, I talked before about yeah.
I think he's looking for some kind of term of what the methodology or processes are.
Whatever's necessary to gather the information, give voice to the Indigenous experience. So basically, I don't have a term for what I do. I use all sorts of different methods and approaches, whether it be sort of focus group, hui, individual interviews, qualitative interviews. I may not be answering his question, but it's about the best I can do. I mean, I'll use whatever strategies or techniques, or even what the communities themselves tell me is their preferred way of doing things. Does that make, yeah. Yeah, I'm not wedded. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, maybe, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, maybe just the idea of engaging methodologies that are, you know, engaged where the research questions are generated by Indigenous communities or Indigenous organisations, where they're actively involved in the research and actively involved in disseminating the findings of the research.
Yep.
Someone else? Yep.
Peter from Fiji. You make a comment that I've heard it throughout all the presentations this morning, but you've sort of summed a comment up. The strength of Indigenous work is that we get closer to people.
Yeah.
And I think from our experience in Fiji, this is very, very true. And I think what you're saying in terms of the Western systems that go through criminal justice, prison, etc., it's a process where what you seem to be promoting is the concept of a voice and an engagement and a relationship that actually brings the wholeness back. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I entirely agree, but it's also an argument. I think what we're arguing for is to, I was going to say seeking, not seeking, we don't ask permission, but what we are demanding, okay, is that our ways of gathering knowledge, disseminating, using it, are seen as equal to all others. Yeah, simple as that. And that's why I know that may have sounded like throwaway lines when I made a couple of quips about, you know, the so-called objectivity of others. Yeah, I was only half joking. Because that's the kind of language, that rhetorical devices that are used to disempower our approaches, you know, we're being more objective and of what have you. What I've called in previous publications a veil of scientism. Well, we use statistics, and I have no problem with that, by the way. Maggie Walters, you know, I think has proven that they can be very beneficial. All right, or we use these observational exercises where we're distant and everything. And I go, why would you want to do that? Because imagine what you're missing. The food, for example, you know. But many other things, you know, sitting outside the tent. There's a lot of flapping going on that's going to be... anyway, I'm riffing now.
I mean, the other thing I'd add to that too is that I think, I mean, it's something we've talked about and one's just been recently criticised for pointing out that a lot of research that goes on in Indigenous communities, we'd argue, is unethical research. Yes. I mean, it doesn't follow, even if you look at the NHMRC guidelines, if you look at AATSIS guidelines, you know, it talks about the need to have engagement and that research be for the benefit of Indigenous people. And yet, in criminology in particular, that's routinely ignored. I mean, the majority of research in criminology is unethical if you take those guidelines seriously, and gets away with it because they're dealing with numbers, they're dealing with administrative data. You know, they don't actually go and talk to people.
They're reviewing each other's work, they're reviewing each other's grants. The same people and the people that they train cycle into this industry of silencing and protection for their particular perspectives. Yeah.
I think that was the white privilege, the power of white privilege.
Mm.
So I saw three more hands, so because we do want to have lunch. Thalia, Dr. Vino, is it Vino? Dr. And Dr. Ulu, PhD, and the third question from here. So if we can go in this order.
Really quickly, where does Indigenous criminology sit within the emerging Southern criminology field and its claim to work for the colonised?
Oh, thank you for that question. This criminology of the global South, this new thing. Oh, well, interesting. Well, from what I've seen so far and heard, I'm waiting with interest because of two things that have occurred. Well, one was last year when one of the, and I won't name names, but the sort of drivers of this new criminology of the global South or global Southern criminology was praising this new wine, you know, this new what do you call them? Vintage in criminological theory and approaches to understanding. And I actually agree. I think that there needs to be an Australasia or a focus in the South of developing criminological theory and approaches to understanding crime control issues that occur here in our communities and move away from dead white guys. okay, and we'll move away from the sort of reliance on Northern. So I fully endorse that, right? But when the adherents say things like, when they're asked a question like, well, you're saying that you're kind of the new kid on the block and you're going to be all this new insightful stuff and it's going to be very indigenous, or they didn't use that word, but I'm paraphrasing, to this context. How do you see it fitting in with these counter-colonial indigenous approaches? And the answer, and Ancha was there, she can correct me, was, but those approaches, they just romanticise the other. They just romanticize the other. So, in other words, we just simply, we don't have an intersectional, sophisticated approach to understanding social harm that occurs in our communities, We're just about going like, just okay, our culture is absolutely wonderful, and you practice it and everything will be hunky-dory, right? Kind of oversimplifying purposely, I think, and denigrating our approach, right? So on that basis, I'm waiting to see where this thing goes, because with this, and that's not only that, but in actual, there was an article published in the British Journal of Crim last year, in which I actually had a friend and colleague, a South African criminologist, that woman emailed me going, this is from the south, isn't it? Like, where you from? Yes. Where's the indigenous stuff in this? So she's so I'm kind of waiting to see how accommodating they will be. Because right now, it just seems to me like it's old wine in old bottles with a new label stuck over it.
To my fellow disruptor, Mark.
I've got the H&M jacket on though.
Absolutely great work there. Also in terms of question, in terms of measurement. And I like your answer in terms of whatever means necessary to get the job done. It's early days yet, we're early days in terms of decolonising systems. You're early days. So we can't probably answer Damien, I know Damien personally, but we can't answer Damien's question because this is early days. We're deconstructing colonialism in the early days. But also in terms of measurement, how would you measure, it's not just collecting of the research, it's also the measurement, the evaluation of what we collect. In Hawaii, they now measure, in the University of Hawaii, they now measure the wellness of the community by the University of Hawaii, they now put their fingers into the soil to feel the richness of soil as a measurement, which is decolonising the measurement process.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of your work, have you gave much thought, or have you put into the process in terms of measurement in a decolonised manner?
No, I haven't personally, but
I think if I could just give a brief answer to that. I can't remember how long ago it was. In the 1990s, when I worked with the Stolen Generations Inquiry, the stats that were always put out about child abuse were put out by the government, and they justified the removal of children. The submissions that came into that inquiry from Aboriginal organisations, particularly in Central Australia, defined Indigenous child abuse as the removal of children. So if you were measuring, from an Indigenous perspective, you'd be measuring child abuse as the taking away of children, whereas governments were measuring something quite different. And I think that, to me, has always brought home the idea that you have to work with communities and Aboriginal Indigenous organisations to understand what those measures might be.
That's fantastic, because this is all new work, and we're making it up as we go because we have to change the structures. So congratulations, thank you.
okay, thank you. We need to go to lunch here. So,
so can I be the disruptor and ask you to ask any questions that you still have during the break? Maybe that's what they're for as well.
Cool, yeah.
And join me in thanking Juan and Chris for the presentation.
Thank you.